Hello and welcome to my review of Brian Aldiss's Helliconia Summer. This is a book that took a long time and a fair bit out of me. It is not a small book by any means. It's nearly 600 pages. It's got some lovely artwork, very topical to the period in which it was published, which was the early 1980s, wraparound visual. See that sea serpent? It's not really a sea serpent, but it looks like a sea serpent. Actually, that's in the story. Surprise! That strange fluffy rug on the front, not so much. But I know what they're trying for. They're trying for a fake, or they did not succeed. So, this book, incidentally, was in much better condition before it lived in my backpacks and handbags for the best part of a week, probably over a week. This has been taking me a long time to read this book, and not necessarily in a good way. In some ways, Helliconia Summer, I found, is easier read than Spring is. Maybe, but I missed the science that was present in Helliconia Spring. There wasn't much here. And the world building in Summer is almost 100% dependent on Helliconia Spring, so don't try reading this without Spring. I think this is the one that I read many years ago and didn't care about it one way or another terribly much. If you've got any care factor at all about spoilers, probably don't watch this until after you've read it. I'll try to remember to post a link to Helliconia Spring and what I thought about that below. If you're about to read the Helliconias, read them first and then watch this review, because I'm not even going to think about spoilers. I don't think you can spoil something from the 1980s, and I honestly don't think you can spoil this book because there's so little that happens in it that you can't really spoil it, I think. My opinion. Very subjective. So, I did kind of like the initial part of the book in that, very specifically, I liked what he did to begin with, which was this sense of subdued impending doom, because as Helliconia rotates around its own little sun in a complete orbit, but this complete orbit rotates around the larger sun, that's Freya, and it's much larger and much hotter. I think it's an elliptical orbit, if I remember correctly. But as Helliconia and its own little sun get closer and closer to Freya, Helliconia gets hotter. So we started off in spring, we're now fully in summer. And in the first part of the book, this increasing heat is described as a plot element, and I like that. As an Australian who has travelled within Australia, I know how inimical and life-threatening the sun and heat can actually be. As Helliconia goes into summer, you have things like trees bursting into flame. You've got people who can't travel during sunlight hours. You've got one whole city, I've forgotten its name, something beginning with P, like Penida or Penne or something like that. Anyway, something beginning with P is mostly built underground to give relief from the sun, and that reminded me of Cooper Pedy, which is in outback Australia. So I enjoyed that. But that sense of impending doom slowly vanished, and then it was a fantasy book. The early 80s were when fantasy and science fiction were sort of congealing out into two separate things. It wasn't just SFF anymore. You had the science fiction and you had the fantasy, and you're starting to get more sciencey, hard science, and more epic fantasy-ish fantasy. Aldiss's Helliconias are still described as science fiction, and in Helliconia Spring there was science. This one was very much an epic fantasy, and if there's one phrase that I can bring in about this book, I would say damned with faint praise. There are good things about it, but the very things that are good about it are also the things that make it not the most amazing read for me personally. So, Helliconia Spring had plenty of fantasy elements, but it also had a lot of science. Now, not the hard science, you didn't have the physics or the engineering, but what you did was have a lot of ologies. You had botany, you had zoology, you had geology, you had paleontology, you had astronomy, and it all meant that you got the science experience from it. Summer really has none. It has vague mentions of the astronomy that has gone before to remind us it exists. In the last, I think, 150, 200 pages, Aldiss goes, oh, wait, this is meant to be science fiction, and mentions botany and zoology a couple of times, but glancingly. So what is in all these 600 pages of Helliconia if it isn't science fiction? Well, it starts off with a queen who's in exile, about to be divorced by the king, and that, right there in the beginning, is where I went, oh, we're going with fantasy here. Because while I started out loving science fiction, I went through quite a few years where I read a lot of fantasy. And I also did D&D, so the Margaret Weiss, Tracy Hickman, the Salvador trilogies. I read a lot of fantasy is what I'm saying, and I loved it. I started to move away from fantasy maybe a decade or two ago, and a couple of the reasons were the names. Every time you start a fantasy, you have to cope with learning the entire geography and history of a new country, land, world, whatever. And one of the ways that fantasy writers, one of the tools they use to make you really, really realize that you're doing fantasy is names. Now, I agree. If you're trying to convince us we're on planet Gobbledygook, on nothing to do with human race at all, you can't really call your main protagonists Joseph and Mary, can you? But there's limits into how many letters and syllables you need to smush in there to convince us we've got a new character. So let's start. Number one, the seacoast of Beryllium. So the country's name is Beryllium. I can deal with Beryllium. I'm maybe not pronouncing it right, but I can deal with the name. The rock was now domesticated by a name. It was known as the Linean Rock. I can deal with Linean Rock. There probably even is a Linean Rock somewhere on Earth, as most things. The bay and the place were named Grava Baga Linean after the rock. And that's when I started to get a ding-ding of alarm. This is going to be fantasy, and it's going to be the 101 vowels fantasy. And yes, indeed. So into the flood, we were introduced to the Queen of Beryllium. The Queen of Beryllium was definitely the wake-up call. Mighty Mim Ingagala. Mirrored Imig Gala. Whatever. But what's worse is in this particular Berlinese country, everyone's name, two names are smushed together, and you've got two initials, one at the start, one in the middle. But you still have to pronounce the whole goddamn stream of them, and oh my god, did I get sick of that. Names that go on for 101 syllables. It's just purest fantasy, and I don't love it. Have you noticed that I really don't love it? I don't love it. Okay, so we've got the Queen, and she's doing stuff, and she's miserable, and she's going to be divorced by the king, and we totally failed to connect to any of these characters. We've established this is all going to be fantasy, and then, oh great, yahoo, we have a flashback. I don't like flashbacks. It's not my favourite authoring style. There's times when it works, but there's only so much. So then we flash back to a battle to establish that the king is a complete moron. And, you know, I was already convinced the king is a moron. He would be a moron. He would be a moron and a coward and a really uneducated idiot and catastrophically hormone imbalanced if he was a real character. That last bit, not sure that he ever really is. And I'm not even going to try and pronounce his name. Forget it. It starts with a J. It's not the king beginning with J. But it turns out that the flashback is basically the whole book. We get a little bit, tiny little bit here. Then we get this much that's all flashback. And then right here at the end, we finally catch up with that initial bit. And I don't know why you did that, but I'm sure there's a reason. I don't know what it was. Doesn't spring out. Whatever. So throughout this, we've got the Queen. We go back in time to when the King first decided to divorce the Queen, and it was a political decision because he's a useless general and he's losing on his wars, and he's also very stupid. And they've got a son and a daughter, and the daughter's really young, and she's 4 or something. Whatever. Exiled with the Queen. There's a son who hates his father and is batshit crazy. Is he meant to be batshit crazy, or is that just Aldiss's writing? I'm not sure. I think he's meant to be batshit crazy. Hates his father, goes off wandering with nomads. And the King does lots of stupid stuff, and there's all these advisors who advise him poorly. And do you think that I cared about any of these characters or any of these machinations? If you're going to do a whole thing that is mostly political intrigue, you need to be able to politic. And I don't think that Aldiss could politic. He certainly couldn't character. So we've got all these characters politicking. And they can't. And I didn't love it. So let's see what else happens. So after a certain amount of the King raving mad, he scowls himself on the back all the time because he believes in a religion or something. He's got a chancellor who's his advisor, who's good friends with the Queen, who's a scientist, who's an atheist. How likely is it to have a chancellor who's an atheist in a violently religious batshit? I don't know about that. Anyway, they do. Then as a counterpoint to all this really poor fantasy, we've got the satellite with the Earth humans monitoring Helliconia. It's called Abyssinia or something like that. And apparently once a year they do this lottery, and the winner is allowed to go down to the surface of Helliconia, even they know they're going to die of this virus. I feel that they could do something about that if they're scientifically advanced, but they choose not to. They give someone the option of going down to the planet knowing they're going to die of this rotavirus eventually. And Billy Pin, something or other. He does that. He wins the lottery and he goes down. We slowly watch him wander around Helliconia, making a complete cock-up of it until he finally dies at the end. So you've got the Billy Pin narrative, and you've got the crazy King narrative, and you've got the Chancellor and the Queen's out there somewhere doing something, whatever. As a plot recap for over 500 pages, that's not much. But that's not me. There's not much. It's a lot of writing and not a lot of content. We have little isolated bubbles of content. On page 177, we finally found out that 20 Earth years equal 14 Heliconian. So you can sit down and do the maths, but in Helliconia Spring, Yulia 10 years Heliconian was almost a man. And Princess Unpronounceable in this book at 9 was of marriageable age. Okay, whatever. They're not even human. Or are they human? And that's a debate throughout the book. Are they human? Because they present as human. There's clearly... My feeling for a lot of this book was that Aldiss was eventually going to let us know that humans had originally landed on Helliconia with their dogs and their poor dolphins and their all these other earth and pigs and goodness knows what. All these completely earth things. Madder. They have madder, which is random. And dolphins. How's a dolphin going to survive a complete ice winter? I don't know. Aldiss doesn't tell me that either, but never mind. So yeah, for most of it, I assumed that they were actually humans. And Aldiss is doing something funky with the human versus non-human, and I don't think it works. He's got the Phagors, which are a different evolutionary strand. They've got yellow blood, which may be antifreeze, it's suggested. And they're more closely related to these other yelks and bi-yelks or whatever that are similar. Then you've got the humans that are more closely related to Mahdi's. And a couple of other animals that aren't quite human but can sometimes interbreed with them. And I'm going, this is funky. This is really, really funky. And an explanation is forthcoming, but it's a pretty minimal one. It didn't do much for me. It wasn't till around about page 200 that I started to feel in any way invested in the story, and then it went for a while quite fast. Then it had another deeply depressing, boring bit where I didn't want to read. The last 100 pages, I don't know. At page 300, something interesting happening. The unpronounceable chancellor arrived at another unpronounceable civilization, Sibonalese, which is towards the pole, so it's cooler. It's a metal-rich civilization unlike Beryllium. They plan on going to Beryllium with firearms. The development of firearms into a warfare civilization seems to be something that Aldiss was trying for as a subplot. It didn't really go very far on its own though, so I'm not sure about that either. So Sib, whatever. It seems to be vaguely inspired by an Asian civilization or possibly Russian. I got hints of Russian civilizations and hints of Japanese civilizations. None of these individual civilizations really stand out uniquely enough in their own right to say what they are or what Aldiss is trying to do with them. I spent more time wondering what Aldiss thought he was trying to do than I did actually going with what was happening, because it was hard to tell. And Beryllium is meant to be our center stage. This is where the batshit crazy prince and the queen, who is the most beautiful queen in the world and the queen of queens, but is never adequately described, so I've got no idea what she looks like. I think she has dark eyes. They're all Beryllium. So Beryllium should really be the center of this epic fantasy world, only I never really gave a toss about Beryllium or anyone in it. So I thought a war would liven things up. There are a couple of wars that are deeply poorly written. Aldiss is interested in the losing side losing. A couple of tiny tactics creep into one of the wars, but not enough to make it actually feel like you're reading a battle. So what you've got this huge epic fantasy with people whose names you can't pronounce, whose lives you don't care about, going from place to place. And the going from place to place where the world building occurs, that is where Aldiss scores high. He is really good at describing the world, and the best way he has of doing that is having some random character traveling through it. So you've got Mad Prince Robbie de Rob, whatever, traveling with the Mahdi's. These are non-human, but the Queen of Eldorado married a human, and they've got the princess that the deeply batshit king is gonna marry, so they can't be that inhuman. Anyway, they're perpetual nomads. They travel routinely around the world, round and round, and you can follow their track because he describes it as the cross-pollination that happens through travel. So seeds travel with people and they sprout along the way. And the Mahdi have been traveling for so long that you've got these vegetative corridors which follow their roots, and there's full trees and there's forests. This is where the madder creeps in. They use the madder to stain for their carpets. Not gonna go further into evolutionary questions of madder. Not going there. Anyway. But yes, that part was really interesting. Then you've got Chancellor Unpronounceable gets kicked out by the Mad King, and he goes off onto the Sib whatever. And his travels, again, really interesting. There's Billy Pin comes down from the space station. His travels are also interesting. It's just nothing else really is. So, yes, all of that epic fantasy that I didn't care about with people traveling around, which was mildly interesting, but was not most of it, and deeply and fundamentally missing the science from the first one. The uniqueness of the flora and fauna and the wild zoology that was wild in spring is absent here, or at least if not completely absent, it's incidental. Now we've just got mundane snakes and lions and dogs. Even the really interesting hoxneys from the spring book have just basically morphed into dun brown horses. And while Aldiss tries to give us an evolutionary perspective on that, it fizzles. It doesn't really go anywhere. Chancellor Unpronounceable is studying the Hoxneys, and he's found that they're actually brown, but they're stripes and striped brown, so the wild colours from Helliconia Spring are still there. You could have done so much with that, Aldiss. Fail. Oh, yes. The most beautiful woman in the world, Queen of Queens, swimming with the dolphins, who are her familiars, because Aldiss thinks that dolphins are attracted to menstrual blood. And that's a bit ick. And it was definitely written in the 80s when all things dolphin there was first virtually cetacean worship, but we didn't know that much about them. That is not true. Dolphins are not thought to have a sense of smell as of the book that I'm currently reading, which is only a couple of years old. They are not attracted to blood. That's sharks. And yeah, that was just a little bit ick, I've got to say. On page 78, I was briefly excited when Aldiss mentions Umwelt as a description also in the non-fiction book I'm reading, which describes the sensory sphere in which an animal lives. And ours is predominantly visual. So I'm looking at the books, I'm looking at the screen, I'm looking at my bird up there who's looking back at me, because as a bird he has got great visual range. But my vision is basically here forward, whereas my bird's vision he has eyes on either side of his head. So he has a whole sphere where I only really have half a sphere. That half a sphere is my visual Umwelt, but also the sense of temperature and air movement and everything. When he mentions Umwelt for the sensory sphere of an animal was exciting. Again, it was a bit of a fail. He mentions it, but he doesn't really take it anywhere too exciting. Okay, again, Aldiss is knocking himself out with the inexplicable ancipitals and prognostics, neither word of which I can identify, neither of which make any sense. They're used incessantly and inconsistently. So as in when he says the Mahdi's are prognostic in one sentence, but they're ancipital in the next. And I'm really annoyed by ancipital and prognostic, I've got to say. And oh yes, the words. Aldiss's words. He likes words. He likes a lot of words. Then we've got words that are clearly invented for Helliconia by Aldiss specifically. Like the Hoxneys. Fine. He uses Edda for the centre or the heart of a person's being. And he's invented some weird word. Is it Huxley or Hockey? I don't know. And that's either their brain or their eyes or something thereabouts that I still haven't figured out after over 1,000 pages. But he's got that thing happening. He invents a lot of weird words for sex, and he can't seem to use the same one twice. There's a period of about 150 pages where every time male genitals are mentioned, they're called prodos. Sure, and every time the sex act between man and woman is mentioned, it's called something with 3 T's in it. Titular, titrate, I don't know. Lots of T's. But for the rest of the time, he can't seem to use the same word twice, whether it's for a breast or a nipple or sex or anything to do. And he uses a strange word that sounds like Kumar for, is it a sex drive? A soul? I've got no idea what he's on about. I assume he has an idea, but he isn't conveying it well. And very inconsistently. So you've got all those words, but then we've got these other words. Enantiodromen on page 368 and retromingent on page 440. Now, I have a reasonable vocabulary, but I did not know what those words were. I had a mild suspicion that they were real words and not invented words like proto or whatever. So I googled, and they are real words. Do you know what they mean? No? Retromingent? Haven't mentioned that in conversation recently? Well, unless you work on hippos, camels or raccoons, you've got no reason to know what retromingent is. I would not know what retromingent was either, except I could Google it. And if you care enough, you can Google it too. But while you're Googling, reflect that this came out in 1983 and the poor person reading it back then would have had no resource of Google. So I don't know what Aldiss was trying to do. Was he trying to be clever? Was he trying to convince other people that he was clever? Whatever he was trying to do, don't love it. I really, really don't love it. And the writing in general, lots of writing. All this writing was not brilliant. I think it's a writing style and some people will love it and some people won't. I read Roger Zelazny, every paragraph is joy. Same with John Wyndham, really. Aldiss is not that for me. He might be for you, he might be for some people. Not for me. I found the writing was 80% very workmanlike. Nothing special. Occasionally you'd have this wild flights of fantasy like The Strange Words, and then Theodromen from page 368, he suddenly fell in love with that. That basically means the complete opposite of something. And he used it incessantly for about 100 pages, and even in places where you didn't really need to know that something was an antiodromen to what it previously was. It's like, if you've changed your mind, you've just changed your mind. You have an antiodromen to your mind, right? Is what I'm saying. And then you had these other isolated events where Aldiss apparently remembers that what he's actually trying for is a deathless work of literature or whatever. Or maybe someone reminded him that there were such things as Nebula Awards to win, and he thought he'd better up his game a bit. And then he starts inserting these occasional florid descriptions in the Hemingway Lawrence Durrell style, such as one on page 453, where the waves have cucumber hearts. And I had to stop and think about the cucumber hearts of waves, because I've bumped into a large number of waves and I live on the coast. There's waves out there. Not a single one of them has cucumbers in it. I think what he's trying to do there is that Tender in the Night, where they're driving home past a sea coloured like a carnelian in the sunset. Carnelian works better than cucumber. Just saying, if that's what he was trying for. If anyone does know why his waves had cucumber hearts, please tell me. Please. Oh yes. The absence of unique botany does change a little bit. Not only when we're going with the nomadic Mahdi's around the world, that was good, I liked that. But when Aldiss decides to go into sex scenes, he seems to go for botany descriptions. And there's one particularly awkward one where you've got this memory or flashback or dream sequence or something like that, where the queen is emoing about how she and the king used to be such a good pair until he decided to divorce her in order to marry this half-human princess. This tedious and difficult to read diversion, where a gwing is a fruit, but it's also a metaphor for the sun, and then the fruit is a metaphor for sex, and then you've got a boar, because remember we've got all these earth animals everywhere now, and the boar eating the gwing fruit was a metaphor for the king rutting, possibly with the queen? I don't know. It was deeply unerotic. It was more than slightly juvenile. It felt like Aldiss was prurient and was reluctant to describe adult themes, but he was writing an adult book, so he occasionally needed to insert sex, and the way he did that was to invent a fruit that doesn't exist, the gwing, which kept on reoccurring after that. Quite a lot of gwings appeared. The gwing boar son just made me feel like he didn't really want to write anything adult. So yes, while the journeying parts of the book are definitely Aldiss's greatest strength, you've got the chancellor Svarti. It's not Slartibartfast. I keep thinking Slartibartfast, but no, Svarti something or other. or Prince Roby or whatever. There's a trader early on who carries the Queen's letter to someone that she hopes will save her from being killed by the king. Each one of these travels was interesting. The original travel with the Queen's letter, that was where we saw the influence of the sun on the planet and the underground Penne city and all those things. Slartibartfast or whatever, traveling to the poles, that was where we got to see a bit more civilizations, because he's an actual scientist. He's thinking about things analytically as he's going, and that was good as well. But when we weren't journeying and we had no science, all we were left with was this epic fantasy with characters that failed to engage. Now, Aldiss's characterization continues to mystify me. I have a really good sense of them as individuals, despite their impossible names, which I can't remember or pronounce. But only once in all these 600-ish pages, which took me over a week to read, did a chapter start with a person who I couldn't instantly remember. And that's actually really good. It's unusual in epic fantasy where you have lots of different strands and lots of different people. I often don't remember them. Not here. However, while I do know who they were, I don't care about them at all. I'm not interested. They are not three-dimensional. They are stereotypical two-dimensional cutouts. This has already been a long video. I don't normally do them this long, but it's a long book, so fair enough. I'll wrap it up soon. I just want to say that at the end, there were about 150 pages, which I was really sculling through them. They were really good. I was enjoying them. I'd got into the vibe. I kept reading. I wanted to pick it up for pretty much the first time in the whole novel. I was looking forward to being able to read it. And then, unlikable King Moron makes it to Eldorado, which is the town from Helliconia Spring. He's gone there to marry the princess, who is half human. And I've got to say, all of Aldiss's failure to describe people really peaks here. So the Mahdi are these not humans. They're described as having 8 opposable fingers on one hand. Think about that. Think about that. Is that human? I don't think so. But they can interbreed with humans. And apparently a Mahdi princess was lame, so she was thrown out of the nomading tribe. She ended up in Eldorado, and she pleased the king, and he married her and had 2 princesses out of her. The Mahdi's are described as having a beak-like nose, a receding chin, a completely receding forehead. So you've got a bird-like perspective. Now my bird who's squirking over there, I think he's gorgeous as a bird. Would I find him attractive in human form? No. And the thing is that the Helliconia people don't seem to either. They describe the Mahdi's as ugly, unattractive. They treat them as less than human. But at the same time, Aldiss is trying to convince us that these 2 princesses who don't look human are also very, very attractive. And it doesn't work. It doesn't work at all. So yes, we've got King Batshit Crazy. He's in this town. He's gone there even though the girl he was engaged to has been murdered. The king doesn't want him to marry his second daughter, so he arranges some floofed up trial to convince the king of killing the first girl, even though he wasn't anywhere in the city at the time. And there's a trial. The trial is embarrassingly bad. That was the first time I actually almost skim read. It was wince-worthy bad. When you're reading something that's so bad that you're actually involuntarily twitching at how bad it is. That's how bad. And that trial convinced me in a way that nothing else previously has, that Aldiss's characters appear two-dimensional and stereotypical, not on purpose, not through some convoluted plan of his, but basically because he can't round out characters. He doesn't have the ability to do that. He can't make them multi-dimensional. The trial was so silly it was unreadable. It was like watching a cardboard cutout grandstand in classic Greek opera. It was terrible. And then there was the end. And then it stopped. And maybe that's why I didn't care about any of the characters or any of the kingdoms or anything really that happens in this book. Because the Helliconia trilogy is about Helliconia. It's the planet. It went through spring. It's now going through summer. The next one is going to be going into winter. Not only will all these people be dead and have left no memory, but their entire kingdoms, their entire regions and continents will be dead and gone and buried under snow. If that's what Aldiss was trying for, he could have done it better. And I think that was what he was trying for. So overall, less interesting this spring. I'd rate it 2 out of 5 stars on Goodreads, and I'd be feeling like I was being overly complimentary, really. It's probably more like a 1 star, but I normally 1-star books I can't finish or loathed. I didn't loathe this, I just didn't really much care. And that's an awful lot of didn't much care that I put up with right there. Fantasy tends to be more of an easy read than science fiction for me, because I like concentrating on science, whether it's science fact or science fiction. So this should have been easier to read, and in places it was. But overall, where Helliconia Spring wasn't a slog, this was at times a real slog. It was always work. I am going to read Winter, but I need a break. I need real stories with actual people and events that I care about and words that I can pronounce and things that make sense, and an author who isn't so prurient that he has to write about sex in terms of a boar eating gwing fruit on the ground under a hedge or whatever he was doing. So yes, I'm really sad. I've always liked Brian Aldiss's writing. No matter what various award systems think, I'm not seeing Helliconia as his crowning glory. Thank you very much for putting up with 37 minutes of me whining about this book. If you're about to read it, choose your battles. If you read it and loved it, I want to hear from you. If you read it and hated it, did you hate it for the same reasons that I found it very hard work, or were there other reasons that I didn't even notice? Whatever. Thank you very much for watching. Read good books, not necessarily Helliconia, but maybe if it's your cup of tea, Helliconia is your good book, and if so, read it.